Welcome back to my series on making a military rifle stock. The stock blank is fully inlet for the action, and now I can move on to shaping the exterior. The stock blank was roughly cut oversized in all dimensions, enough to warrant the use of the bandsaw to remove excess material before I get started shaping with the chisel and spoke shave. I have a choice of which end to start with. I'm going to start with the buttstock first. But before I get started cutting, I need to measure and mark where to cut. I'll start with the very end, measuring how long the buttstock is. To do so, I'll use my large calipers and measure the original stock from the rear tang to the butt plate. I'll need to accommodate the thickness of the butt plate as I transfer the length measurement to the stock blank. I'm setting the square slightly ahead of the mark. To measure the other key dimensions, I have a flat piece of wood on the workbench and I'm laying down both the stock blank and the original stock. I want these markings to be more accurate than simply tracing the original stock's outline onto the blank. With both stocks upside down and secured to the wood so that the wood equals an extension of the top lines of the stock, I'm going to measure the drop of the comb, or from this perspective, the gap between it and the wood. I'll stack blocks until they just barely touch. Then I can move the original stock out of the way and use the same blocks to mark the stock blank. I'll repeat the process at the very rear. The end of the buttstock is at an angle. It doesn't matter what the angle is, just that I can copy it to the stock blank. To do so, I'll use this tool called a bevel gauge. I'll set the handle flat on the wood and align the arm against the original stock's butt plate and lock it down. And then I'll transfer the angle of the butt plate to the stock blank. I'll worry about the angle at the bottom when I fit the butt plate. While I have the two stocks side by side, I'll run the pencil along the bottom of the original stock to transfer that outline to the stock blank. I'm being careful to keep the pencil flat, but this is just an estimation. When I go to make the cuts, I'll cut the bottom here oversized. With the stocks flat now, I'll connect the two marks on the comb that I made earlier. And to make sure that the bottom line isn't off by too much, I'll do a quick sanity check with dividers, comparing the original stock to the markings on the stock blank. If I happen to stray to the line when I'm cutting, I don't want the stock to end up too thin. And that's the next step, to make the cuts. To start, I'll bring the very end to its final length. I'm starting here because the cut needs to be square to the stock, so it's much easier to cut while the stock blank is still squared up itself. To make the cut, I'm going to be using the table saw. It's hard to remove the tool marks the bandsaw would leave on a large surface of end grain, while also maintaining its flatness. I essentially want this to be a finished cut, and I can get a nice, even, and accurate cut with the table saw and the proper blade. I'll align the mark I made to the slot on this crosscut sled, lift up the blade, and then make the cut. With that one cut complete, I'll move to the bandsaw for the rest. I'll follow the lines that I marked earlier, cutting those on the top side to the line, and those on the bottom side oversized. Back on the workbench, I'll redraw the center line using the square from both sides. Later on, I'll be using this line to ensure that materials are moved evenly from both sides. With the stock flipped over, I can repeat the process on the top, the wrist, and the comb. I'm adding this wood here as a stop. You'll see why in a bit. I'll continue the center line on the end of the stock. The wood is clamped to the comb as a stop for the butt plate, which I'll place on upside down. I'm making sure the cutouts on the butt plate for the screw hole and the trap are centered on the line. Then I'll trace around it. I'm going to continue fitting the butt plate. Since the butt plate has a trap door in it, I'll take it off the original stock to see how the inside is cut. In there is this, a metal oiler. It was inside the upper hole. There's also another hole on the bottom, but that's just for weight reduction. It's hard to see in the upper hole, but at the bottom of the recess for the oiler, there's also 3 holes for a takedown cleaning rod. I don't have an original cleaning rod for any of my crags. For this stock, I just want to do the bare minimum to fit the oiler. I'll mark its depth. And measure its diameter at the widest part. I found a drill bit that's just over the diameter of the oiler. I'll mark the depth. Before I start, I want to be very careful that I'm drilling straight. I don't want to go on an angle and then end up breaking out the side of the stock, or going too far up or down. To help with that, I'll add these 2 blocks of wood on either side as a guide for the drill. I'll have to manage the up and down myself. I'll start by marking a center hole, and then I'll begin the hole with a smaller wood bit. This drill is actually wider than the other one I'll be using, so I can only go so deep before it runs into the guides that I added. But all I need is the hole started. I'll bore it out with the large bit now. The oiler fits up in there now, without too much room for it to move around. Looking at the butt plate, the hole matches up with the trapdoor. Now I just need to fit this area for the pivot and the spring. I'll measure the distance between the screw hole and the spring retaining screw and transfer that to the stock. What I'll do is drill a hole here, and then a series of them up above that to hog out the material. I'm going to route for the top tang of the butt plate now. Just like when using the router to inlet for the action, I want additional supports for the base. I'd like to trace around the tang, but I can't get it flat against the stock blank. That's due to the bend at the bottom and the radius where the tang meets the butt plate. The bend being further down I can deal with, but this radius pulls it away as it lowers. I'll roughly round over this edge. And now that it's closer, I can trace around it. I'll get out the router and set the depth stop to just over the thickness of the tang, and then I'll start the cut. That's pretty close. It does need some fine tuning, but I need to bring the butt plate fully against the stock. And to do that, I'll draw on the curve at the bottom of the butt plate. I'll cut it out with the bandsaw. But before I move to the bandsaw, I also want to mark the width of the stock. I'll use dividers to measure the narrowest point of the original stock. Which is between these 2 points. And I'll transfer those areas to the stock blank using a rule to help position them. Next, I'll measure the width of the front action screw. I'll do the same at the width of the front of the magazine area. Last, I'll measure the width of the butt plate. With the stock blank fully marked up, I'll move it over to the bandsaw. Now that the stock blank is on the bandsaw, I can show why I marked the width on the underside. With it right side up, as I progress in the cut, the stock rides up and away from the table. With it upside down, I can place a scrap piece under the comb and have it well supported during the thickest part of the cut. I'll start cutting with the curve at the bottom of the butt plate, and then cut the sides. With the sides of the stock blank roughly cut to width, I'll use a hand plane to clean up the end of the buttstock where the blade exited the wood and created a small step. I'm going to proceed with fully fitting the butt plate. The main areas that require attention are the tang, the radius here, and the curve at the bottom. To save me some trouble of fitting it across the whole width, I'll remove some of the excess material just off the very end. I'm using this tool called a draw knife. I'm still learning how to use it, but I can use it to remove a small shaving. Or increasing the angle, I can take a larger bite and remove more material. Most of the material around the butt plate has been removed. Now to fit it. The width of the tang is preventing it from fitting closer. I'll chisel these two areas. That's better. Now to tackle the radius where the tang meets the flat butt plate. Right here is where I realize I shouldn't be chiseling in from the ends. I should only be taking down the area between the two side walls. The top of the butt plate is fitting well now, both the tang and the radius. I had used lipstick just like when I was inletting to see the areas that were touching. You can see the result of my mistake earlier. Here and here. The edge on the top side shouldn't have been rounded over. But moving on, now to turn my attention to the curve at the bottom of the butt plate. To better fit this area, I'll again use lipstick on the butt plate to see where it's touching. And then I can bring down those spots with the chisel and file, repeating the process until it fits well. That's quite a lot of the lipstick transfer. I'll call this a good fit. Now to mark and drill the holes for the screws. I'll do the same for the tang screw, marking the hole a bit low so that the screw pulls the butt plate tight against the stock. Whenever I'm putting a screw into wood, especially in a fresh hole, I'll coat the threads in paste wax to serve as a lubricant and help them go in. Despite the wax, the large screw in particular is tough to thread in. Looking back, this is pushing the limits, and I should have stopped and drilled it the next size up. But I got it to go in. I'm happy with the fit of the butt plate against the stock. Now to fit the sling swivel, which goes on the center line of the bottom of the stock. For positioning, I'll measure how far it is from the end on the original stock and transfer that over to the stock blank. Instead of holding it and tracing around it, I'll mark the two holes and drill them out. The screws get waxed just like the butt plate screws. Now with the sling swivel secured to the stock blank, I can trace around it without it moving around. I'll take it off, and since I'm going to be using the router, I'll add additional supports, aligning them flush with the bottom of the stock blank. I'll set the depth stop to the thickness of the sling swivel, and then raise it up just a bit to account for removing the tool marks from the bottom of the stock blank. That's a tight fit. A few taps with the hammer should get it to fit in there. The sling swivel isn't fully down in the mortise that I cut. It's stopped by the loop, and the fact that I still need to round off the bottom of the stock and bring it down slightly. I'm going to continue fitting the metal parts to the stock, and the last major piece on the buttstock is the trigger guard. I'll start by using the front action screw hole to secure the front, align the rear, and then I'll trace it out. I know that I cut the underside of the stock blank oversized, so the trigger guard won't be inlet flush to the stock blank, it will be below flush. I'll measure the thickness at the front on the original stock, and see what the stock blank measures at the same area. Then I'll subtract one from the other to see what the difference is, how much below flush the front of the trigger guard will be. I'll do the same for the rear action screw. For that, I'll need to add the two barreled actions. I'll measure from the rear tang to the rear of the trigger guard, right where the rear action screw would be. I'll mark where I measured from. I can't get the calipers to the spot on the tang where I marked. The sides of the stock blank are in the way. Since these will be rounded off during shaping anyway, I'll roughly chisel them down just enough to get the calipers onto the tang. Now I can get my measurement and compare that to the previous one. So in order to inlet for the trigger guard, the front needs to be recessed 80 thousandths below the surface, and the rear needs to be 50 thousandths below. I set up one support block, and I'm using a square to try and align the stock so that it touches at the front and it is 30 thousandths above at the rear. The 30 thousandths being the difference between the 80 and the 50 thousandths below the surface that the trigger guard needs to go. It's all a matter of trial and error to get it set up correctly. Once I have the stock at the correct angle in relation to the board, I'll clamp the two together, locking it in. I'll add a board to the top where the router will go, which will make it easier to align my second support board on the close side of the stock. It's pulling away as the vise is closed, so I'll add some clamps to hold it in position. And then I can take the top board off. All said and done, it's a roundabout way of ensuring that I maintain the same angle while adding a second support. I'll double check with the square. It's touching at the front. It has a 30 thousandths gap at the rear. To set the depth stop on the router, I need to add 80 thousandths to the thickness of the trigger guard. If I did everything right, the rear will be 50 thousandths below flush. But I will need to fine tune by hand after I use the router since the bottom of the trigger guard isn't flat. It's convex and can be rocked slightly on a flat surface, so I'll need to carve out the middle by hand. But the router will ensure that I get the front, back, and the sides at the correct dimension. To set the depth, I'll touch off at the front and use blocks equal to the depth that I need to go on the depth stop. And then I can start routing. It's a tight fit. That's due to the angles at the front and the back not being 90 degrees. Now I'll tackle the curve at the bottom of the trigger guard. Compared against a straight edge, you can see how slight of a curve it is. I'm not able to rock the trigger guard anymore, meaning that it's sitting flat against the inletting. Now I'll check to see how it compares against the measurements that I was targeting. That's within range, I think. Now I'll mark the rear action screw hole. I'll use a square to transfer the location of the hole to the side of the stock. To mark the location of the hole on the top side, I'll measure the distance of it from the tang on the action and transfer that to the stock blank. I'll remove some of the excess epoxy to be able to mark the location with a pencil. And then I'll use a center punch. Again, I'll transfer the marking to the side of the stock. And connect the two of them. This line represents the path that the drill will follow. I'll move the stock blank over to the drill press. Here I'm aligning the drill bit with the line that I drew earlier. The bit needs to be following the line as it goes down in order to end up in the correct spot. But instead of drilling all the way through in one shot, I'm only going to go about halfway. Then I'll flip it over. Align the drill bit again with the mark that's now on the far side of the stock blank. And drill the rest of the way through. This bit is one small increment larger. That just connected the two holes if they were slightly misaligned, while also giving clearance for the screw to easily go in and out. To test if the hole is in the right location, I'll add the action back into the stock, and then add the trigger guard. That's all of the metal parts added to the buttstock. I was planning on shaping the buttstock in this video, but as you can see, there's a lot of things to do before diving into shaping. It's the most obvious step in the process of making a stock, that is getting a chunk of wood to look like a nicely shaped and flowing stock, but these preparations beforehand are important steps along the way to ensure that the stock is symmetrical and to make sure that all of the additional parts fit. I don't want to get to a point where I need to inlet for the swing swivel, for example, but there's no way for the router to balance on a curved surface. And that's why the title of this video is Preparing to Shape the Buttstock, or something along those lines. I promise that I will get to shaping in the next video. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.